I want to thank our host, Yossi. Welcome to everybody. We are being live streamed on YouTube and always with a recording available. For those who did not see the change in the title of tonight's Shiur, and in light of the circumstances this week, we made a decision to change the title to The Suicide of Chaim Walder. Can we separate the sin from the sinner? I would imagine that most, if not all of you, have read and heard and seen the dramatic story of the suicide of Rabbi Chaim Walder earlier this week. He was a very significant figure in the Haredi community, essentially as an author, particularly of children's books. His books were among the top 10 books ever sold in the history of Israel. So that gives you a bit of a inkling into the tremendous amount of influence that he had. He also was a columnist. He was had a radio program. So he was all over the media. And he was the subject of investigation on numerous counts of sexual impropriety, in particular with children. And there were no less than 24 testimonies against him for sexual crimes committed. At one point, he said to the Beit Din that was investigating him that if he would be found guilty by them, he threatened to kill himself. And that's exactly what he did. When he was found guilty by this Beit Din, headed by Rav Elihu of Tzfat, he went to the grave of his son and he killed himself, leaving a note that said, among other things, I will take this Beit Din to the Beit Din Shel Mala, to the heavenly court, with me when I go. This dramatic event has created a hurricane of interest as well, a storm within the Haredi community. And it has been aggravated or enlarged by a number of things that have taken place since he killed himself. First of all, at the Shiva, the chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Lau, paid a visit, which garnered a tremendous amount of publicity. Talk more about that later. At the funeral itself, a representative of Ezer Mitzion, which is a well-known service organization within not only the Haredi, but the general community, gave a hesped, a eulogy at his funeral. And perhaps most disturbing is that he was referred to in print with the approbation and initials Zatzal, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. May the righteous be remembered as a blessing. And although there has been a reaction, in other different kind of reaction in some areas or some quarters of the Haredi community, his books, for example, were pulled off the shelves by Eichler Book Chain, which is the primary bookstore that serves the Haredi community. And there certainly have been some who have come out in condemnation of his actions. Nevertheless, this is an ongoing debate. And what we want to talk about tonight is, must we sever ourselves not only from the person, but the person's actions, from everything he or she has done in their life? Essentially, can we separate the sin from the sinner, or are they inextricably bound together? We can also ask the question whether tshuva, including and especially death, has the ability to cleanse one completely of sin, or do the sins that are committed leave an indelible stain forever? Now, in this case, of course, even the death of Chaim Walder was tainted in that the very death that, the worst thing that can happen to someone is death. Therefore, generally, it is what we call a kapara, an atonement. But if you kill yourself, your very act of death is a sin against God. And therefore, understandably, that death cannot effect tshuva. And the question we have to ask is, can you do tshuva for every sin, for any sin that one commits? Is tshuva possible? So these are some weighty issues that we're going to try to look at some of the sources tonight. And I want to tie it to the Parsha because in the Parsha Va'era, we see the majority of the plagues striking Egypt, which is an attempt, of course, not only to punish Egypt for what they had done during the 117 years of slavery, to indicate and show in a very dramatic fashion that God is the God of all creatures, of nature, the creator of the universe, but also is a direct challenge to Paro. And Paro is a fascinating character, not only because of his hold over Egypt, but the history of Paro. Without going into all of it, let's just focus on the fact that Paro survives Makat Bechorot. He is the firstborn. That's how he got to be the Pharaoh. Yet he was not killed in the plague of firstborn. And then he is there at Kriyat Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea. And it seems that he died there. And yet there is a strong opinion stated by the Mechilta in Beshalach, also the commentary Yalkut Shimoni, that not only did Paro survive, but he goes on to become king of that famous city of Nineveh in the story of Yonah, the city, the capital of the city-state of Assyria, a perennial enemy of the Jewish people that will end up exiling the 10 tribes of Israel. And yet Pharaoh, Paro, the same one who presided over the slavery in Egypt of the Jewish people, he lives and goes on to become the king of Assyria or of Nineveh, and effects this what we'd call a mapach, a turnover revolution, where the people repent, and although they were doomed to disaster, they are saved. And presumably, Paro is a kind of hero who leads them in doing atonement. So the question there, and it's a favorite question of Susie, and if you accept this story, how can he emerge from this terrible persecution of the Jewish people? I would say with authority, the greatest calamity in Jewish history until the Holocaust. Rashi says 80% of the Jews who lived in Egypt did not survive. So we're talking about a massive, cruel period of time where, of course, Paro was not the Pharaoh for 117 years, but clearly was the one who was indicated, although it's a generic term, but Pharaoh is the one who is the culprit in all of this. And yet he seems to have, according to these sources, survived. How's that possible? Why would he be given another chance? He didn't die in the firstborn, and he didn't die at the splitting of the sea, and he goes on to have this moment of glory. Does that seem right? So we have to ask the question, even relating to Paro, as well as Chaim Walder and others, is it possible that you can achieve these kind of positive things after a life of terrible sin and oppression? This is not the first case we have had, of course, of celebrated individuals who contributed a great deal to society. Chaim Walder, in his case, he made a deep impression on thousands of Haredi children. He was hailed in the Haredi community, even in beyond the Haredi community, as someone innovative, creative, who was doing a lot of good for people. And yet, at the end of the day, turns out to be a villain. We've seen this before. We had the same question regarding Rabbi Mati Elon, who was very charismatic and popular rabbi and speaker and author, who was ultimately convicted by the Jerusalem Magistrates Court on 2 counts of forcible sexual assault against a male minor and a number of other charges against him. And so the question comes out, can we study his farim? Can we quote his chidushim? Is it possible to separate the man from the work and the accomplishments that he had? Or should we basically paint with a wide brush? And this is a deep question. And it's one that now is being asked in a lot of quarters because of this dramatic suicide of Chaim Walder. And I don't think we've even heard all the evidence that everything has come out yet in order to indicate this kind of Jekyll Hyde personality, an individual who could brilliantly write and speak and contribute to the wider community, and yet one who engaged in horrible acts that destroyed many people's lives. And we question, why did the mayor of Bnei Brak come to his funeral and speak praisingly about him? Why did the chief rabbi of Israel make a point of visiting his home? Even though, of course, we're not blaming his family, but still, the chief rabbi does not visit the home of every funeral, of every person who dies. So I want to try to look at some of the sources. Let me say, first of all, before I get into the Jewish sources, this question of trying to separate the sin from the sinners, and is it something that's legitimate or should be avoided, is not only in the Jewish community. Just to cite probably one of maybe the most dramatic example is an event that happened during the Holocaust, when during the years of 1942 and 1943, Nazi scientists used 300 to 400 inmates of concentration camps as human guinea pigs in a particular series of experiments to determine how people survive or die in extreme cold, hypothermia. The purpose of this study, supposedly, was to establish the most effective treatment for victims of immersion hypothermia, particularly crew members of the Luftwaffe, of the German Air Force, who had been shot down into the cold waters of the North Sea. So in order to determine how long they could survive and what they could do to survive, so the Nazis held these experiments. They took inmates, they were held for hours in tanks of bitterly cold water, or they were left standing naked in freezing weather. Some were frozen to death specifically and purposely in attempts to learn how much cold a human could endure before he or she died. Others were brought near to death and then subjected to warming techniques, hot baths or body heat transference from female prisoners, in order to assess the possibility of their recovery after this extreme hypothermia. At least 80 prisoners were killed during these experiments. And then they came to light after the war, and the debate began, could this information be used? Scientists felt that it was the most complete and accurate information about hypothermia that ever had been found, because the Nazis, of course, were willing to let the patients die to see exactly how long they could survive, how cold they could get before they died. So there were many scientists that wanted to use this information. In fact, the military doctors decided that they would indeed print up and distribute and use this information, ironically during the period called the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And they argued that the Nazi hypothermia data was critical to improving methods of reviving people who were rescued from freezing water after boat accidents. And they said, this is something that is going to help other people. So we want to be able to use that information to publicize it, et cetera. And others said, no, you cannot separate the source of the material from the material itself. And since the Nazis killed people in order to get this scientific knowledge, it should remain secret and never be used. In fact, the New England Journal of Medicine refused to publish the data in a celebrated case because they said, we don't want to give any kind of credit or recognition to the Nazis. And it became, you can do some research into it, you'll see that it became a celebrated case and ongoing debate about whether that information can be used. By the way, not only dealing with hypothermia, there were other of these quote unquote experiments of the Nazis. This may be the most well-known, but there were many others that the same question applies to. Would they be able to use the information and, in a sense, disregard where it came from? Well, what do Jewish sources say about this issue? There's a very famous story. I would imagine many of, or most of you have heard the story about the famous Rav Mayor and his wife, Bruria. So in the story, neighborhood thugs or hoodlums are making life miserable for Rav Mayor. And he decides that drastic measures need to be called for. Now, rabbis, at least in those days, were very powerful people on a spiritual level. There are Gemaras that say that they could look at someone and they would just go up in flames, and they had this power to curse others. So Rav Mayor decided that he would pray for these thugs, these hoodlums, to die. Well, Bruria comes along, the brilliant wife of Rav Mayor, and she is not pleased with what he's doing. And she says that it's not right for you to pray for the death of the true. They are hoodlums, but don't pray for their death. She quotes the pasuk, Yitamu chatayim min haaretz u'rishoim odeinam. This is a pasuk from Tehillim, Perek Kuf Daled, where David Amelok says, let the wicked be banished from the earth and evil will cease. Said Bruria to Rav Mayor, it doesn't say, let chotim be uprooted. Yitamu chotim, it says chataim, sins. And so she taught him this explicitly means you don't pray for the death of the sinners. You pray that the sins will be stopped, will be banished, and that the people should repent. And then once they repent and become better people, then automatically the wicked will cease, or the wickedness will cease. And he listened to her, right? She was very brilliant. And even if she isn't, you always listen to your wife. You know that, if my wife is listening. But clearly she was right. Rav Mayor prayed, and that the hoodlums clean up their act and become better people. And then, of course, there was no reason anymore to seek their demise. So that's a classic story indicating that there is a difference between sins and those who commit them. You want to clearly fight against the sins, but it may be possible to divorce them from the sinners. And if you can reach the sinners, the sins will go away. There is a similar idea that we read about in Pirkei Avot. There, in the 6th parak of Pirkei Avot, so we learn the following. The Pirkei Avot teaches us, Halomed michabeiro perek echad, halacha echad, pasuk echad, dibur echad, or afilu ot echad. If you learn from somebody even a single word, letter, a pasuk in the Torah, if you learn anything from someone, sarich lin hag bo kavod, you have to give that person honor. Shekein matzinu b'David melech Yisrael. So we learn about King David. Shelo lamad mi Achitofel el shnei devarim bilvad. He learned 2 things from Achitofel, and although there were just 2, kra'o rabo alufo miyudao. He called him his rabbi, his teacher, his confidant. And if you can give kavod for even 2 things, so certainly someone who teaches you more, alachat kama v'chama, should you not give them kavod? Now, Achitofel, he was an advisor. He was a young man. He died at the age of 33. He was a brilliant young man, and he advised David HaMelech. But at the end of the day, he supported and even encouraged the rebellion of Avshalom, David's son, against the king. And as a result of that, the rebellion failed. Achitophel hanged himself and committed suicide as well. And the Gemara says that he's one of those few people that will be denied entrance to Olam Haba. Well, Pirkei Avot knows this, and yet tells us that as nefarious an individual that Achitophel was, because he did something good, that you have to give him kavod. And it's a very powerful idea, because we are talking about someone that we clearly indicate is among the most heinous of people, because very few people are singled out that they will not merit Olam Haba. Generally, we say in Pirkei Avot, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelik Olam Haba. Every member of Israel has a share in Olam Haba, but he's an exception, and yet you have to give him kavod. So I think that's a very powerful source. But we see this elsewhere as well. Bilam, we call him Bilam Harasha. He was an evil person, no question about that. And he will ultimately be killed by Pinchas and the Jewish people in the fight against Midian. And yet, the things he said, they're lasting icons for the Jewish people. We start our tefillah, Ma tovu ohalech Yaakov. That came out of Bilam's mouth. I have on my wall a picture with his famous statement about the Jewish people, Ki am kalavi yakum uchari nasa, that the Jewish nation, Israel, will crouch and then spring like a lion. That also was one of his statements, and it became quite famous. So you see, even somebody quite evil, nevertheless, can produce something good, and it doesn't mean that we deny he ever said it or refuse to say it. Rav Moshe talks about this issue as well, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he's asked a question, can you sing or use tunes that are written by apikorsim, heretical people? And we have a lot of tunes that we sing, and some people object to it. We use it for Adon Olam, for example. Way back when, I used the tune in my shul in Dallas, Adon Olam, to the tune of Deep in the Heart of Texas. and there are lots of other tunes. And Rav Moshe is asked about that, and he says, well, holy objects, such as the Sefer Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzot, if that was written by someone who is heretical and apikores, then he said you're not allowed to use it. And the moral character and the level of religious observance of the Sofer is relevant to the use of any holy object. But he said songs are different. They're not inherently filled with any holiness. They can be enjoyed and listened to in lieu of the belief of the composer who may have written the music. He says, while it's not advisable to listen to the words of someone who's wicked, there is no halachic sanction against it. So I would personally not want to listen to the songs of the anti-Semite Roger Waters or Wagner and his musical compositions. But in general, says Rav Moshe, it's not a problem. You are not showing support for an individual just by using either their song or the car they invented. We know that, and this was a subject of some debate, but the buses in Israel were all Mercedes buses originally given by Germany to Israel. And so you're seeing German cars driving all around Israel. And none of the rabbis said that you're not allowed to use the cars that were made in Germany. Some people found it distasteful, so they said no, but there was no halacha against it. We're not excusing what Germany did to us, but we're saying that there is a point that the individual and whatever contributions they might make, they're in two different places. I would add also David Amelok's famous declaration, Ki ein adam asher lo yechata. He makes this dramatic comment that there is no individual who does not sin. We all sin. Even Moshe sins, Yaakov sins, etc. So logically speaking, if you hate those who sin, then you hate everyone because everybody sins. So although there are levels of sinning, clearly if you're going to say, I won't accept anything from anyone who sins or talk to anyone who sins or relate to anyone who sins, then you will be alone in the world, at least according to David, who says everybody sins at some point. So the conclusion I would draw from all this is that you cannot honor the person who commits these horrible deeds, but you can appreciate to some extent the good works that come from them. But you have to be careful, especially those who are leaders of the community, that you, must unequivocally condemn the actions of someone who harms other people or who is in and of themselves an immoral person, but be careful not to show undue kavod to them, lest people minimize the crimes they commit. We have to be sensitive first and foremost to those who are harmed and consider the interests and the feelings of the victims and the survivors first. This is why Rav Elihu, who is the head of the Beit Din that censured Chaim Walder, said, first of all, when asked if he had any feelings of regret when he learned of the suicide, said, my feelings of remorse are with the victims and not with the victimizer. And that's who I'm primarily concerned with. And he made the statement that this comment in this statement that Chaim Walder wrote in his letter, I'm taking this Beit Din to the Beit Din Shel Ma'ala, to the heavenly court, said Rav Elihu very caustically, he's not going anywhere near the heavenly court after what he did. So I'm not worried that there's going to be a case against me. So that's clear that the victims come first, and the crimes must be condemned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every book that he wrote should be burned. There's some people that may feel that way and find it so distasteful to read a book or to quote any kind of rabbinic insight. That's up to each and every one. The problem is that when we completely connect the sin and the sinner, we're really on very dangerous grounds. I can tell you on a personal level that in my shul, I allowed quote unquote sinners to freely come and to join the shul. I used to say, there is no sin detector at the door. You walk into the shul, and as long as you don't commit any sins while in the shul, we're not doing a background check of every person who comes in. And we know that some people will come in who are not Shabbat observant into shul. Some maybe have questionable things, about business ethics, but you cannot stop, and we don't have a Geiger counter to see who is completely free of sin to allow them into shul. The only exception I made on a personal level was that I would not allow the shul to give any honors to someone who was a get refuser, who had gone through this process and was officially labeled as someone who was a sorev get, that refused to give a divorce to his wife. That was a stand that I took, and I got a lot of flack for it. There were some rabbis who criticized me for doing that because they said, this is not, you don't want to drive away that person. You want to, if you kind of bring them closer, maybe there's a chance that they will improve and then they will deliver the get. I just had a personal issue that I didn't want. They could come into shul, would not throw them out, but I did not want to give them any honors because of the hurt that would cause to the woman who was being denied the get. Finally, and then some people will want to comment, I'll just end because tomorrow night is the first yort site of Susie's mother, my mother-in-law, Zichrona Livracha, Rachel Leah Klein. She was a survivor of Auschwitz. She was 16 years old when in Auschwitz, and told the following incident, that when the war was over, she lived for a time in France. And on one occasion, she was crossing a bridge in Paris, and suddenly she saw a husband and wife walking, and she recognized that woman who was one of the kapos, who was one of the Jewish women that was in charge of her barracks, who had been very cruel and treated her and ever treated everybody very cruelly. And the woman saw her and saw that she was recognized. She said to her husband, she made some excuse, "You go on ahead, let me speak. This is an old friend I want to speak to." And she asked for forgiveness. And my mother-in-law said, "You can't ask forgiveness for what you've done and the lives you ruined and you harmed." And she took her sheitel, she took her wig that she was wearing, she pulled it off of her and threw it over the bridge into the river, and said, "I won't tell your husband who you are, but don't think that this sheitel is going to save you from being punished for what you did." And essentially, don't try to pretend that because you have a sheitel, all is forgiven. It's not. And it's crucial that we don't condone or dismiss or excuse the evil that's done, even if we fight the sin and not the sinner. Nevertheless, it's a fine line. And so I would suggest that and it's not a simple thing, but we have to sometimes use discretion. And while we have to come down very heavily on criminals, and especially those who use their talents and strengths to harm other people. At the end of the day, it doesn't mean, in my opinion, everything this person did or said has to be discarded. And first and foremost, we do whatever we can to aid the victims and do not celebrate or condone the victimizer. But I think we have to make some kind of separation at some level between the sin and the sinner. So I thank you for listening, and we'll be happy to hear what some few people have to say. Yehudit Spiro, we'll start with you since you wrote in the chat you would like to say something. If you are making a comment, keep it short and to the point. Yehudit.
Try my best. First of all, thank you for being brave enough.
1 second, please. Please, everybody mute. Only one person has their microphone open. All the rest, please be muted. Otherwise, it's going to be, as we say in French, a big balagan. Thank you.
Hey, we say that in Hebrew too. I want to thank you, Rabbi Weiss, for being brave enough to talk about this topic directly. Many people are having a very difficult time with it, or they feel it's not sanua to talk about it. And that's how we got ourselves in this jam in the first place. So I applaud you, and I applaud Rav Shmuel Eliyahu for having the bravery to talk about it. I want to check something before I say it. Why am I getting feedback? Okay. I don't think that Rabbi Lau spoke. He didn't give a hesped, did he?
No, he did not. He did not
give a
hesped.
House.
He was speaking to the family.
Okay,
at
so
the Shiva house.
I was originally, I was upset. He did not give a hesped. I think he felt he was comforting the family. The family must feel absolutely awful. And if it is that because of that reason that he was trying to comfort them, then I don't have any truck with him. On the other hand, those with their Zecher Tzadik Livracha and all their accolades, very, very dangerous. That's all I want to say about that.
Okay. Anyone else who would like to make a comment? Again, short and to the point. Van, you're going to unmute yourself and you can make a comment. You'll have to unmute yourself, Van, because we cannot hear you. Okay. There's a problem there. We couldn't hear him. Okay. If somebody else wants to say something. Okay, maybe Yossi, you might have to, those people that raised their hand, Yossi, you can unmute them. David Barrett, I see as well. Yossi, can they be unmuted? David, you can't unmute yourself. There you go. Go ahead.
I would just like to say I would agree with the previous comment. It must have been devastating for the wife, brother, sis family who are sitting Shiva, some of whom may not have known of his previous conduct, and some, I suspect, has suspicion of his previous conduct. And therefore, to Tanchumim, for the family who are sitting, is important.
Yes.
I do feel, however, that I don't think that his behavior could have gone unnoticed all these years within the Haredi circle. And somewhere down the line, a line was crossed, and I think this is why Rabbi Lau now made it a clear statement. He says that anybody who feels they have been assaulted, you must report it. This is one thing he did. And I think the Haredi world has got a lot of, they have to sit critically amongst themselves and sort themselves out. This is not the first time something like this has come to light.
Yeah, I think that this is a watershed event because a number of Haredi people were among the 24 who came and gave testimony and said, we're not going to keep it a secret, even though, according to what they've said, this Chaim Walder had threatened anybody who came forward and told of what he was doing. He made a lot of very severe threats against them. Okay, Tal, can you unmute yourself there? Or
yes.
There you go.
I would like to make a very, very clear differentiating statement between, for instance, the work that the Nazis
Speak a little
did.
louder.
Can you hear me?
Speak a little louder.
I would like us to make a very clear differentiation between for instance, the scientific evidence collected by the Nazis and the fact that when it was used to save other people or advance humanity, it in some ways gave the deaths of all the sacrifices a meaning, and they didn't die in vain. I'm not sure I agree with that opinion, but it is an opinion, to the contributions of people who were just abusing people for abuse, which could be this rabbi. Again, I don't know all the details, but if we look at other big figures in history, which I think put everything they have contributed in under some sort of question mark. And I'm not sure we can put all of it under the same umbrella.
Well, it's obvious that it's a very sensitive issue, because if you were the person in that experiment, or it was your relative who was killed as a result of it, then obviously you have a different opinion about anything which seems to give, any notoriety or any positive spin to what took place. But yes, it's very, very difficult. Okay, Van.
So I patrol a psychiatric hospital, and I work with children, and I'll keep it brief. And child abuse is really virtual murder, and it's a serious issue, and there's no measurement of how awful it is. However, we're dealing in a tidal wave of complication, because at least in the United States, this has become a litigious society where people are promiscuously using opportunities, whether it's sexual abuse or child abuse, to jump on the bandwagon of, oh, he did this or that, and all of a sudden they're aggrandizing the event into something where they're making it something that it's not, and that's a reality. It's nefarious how people are using, especially in the economy, the opportunity to make money and to jump onto this. So I'm not saying that the Rav didn't do what he did. I heard about it the first time this morning. A Chabad rabbi called me this morning and said, "Did you hear what's happening in Israel?" But I suggest that we don't know all of the details, and that we're not allowing ourselves to be culpable for realizing that people are jumping in litigiously and promiscuous.
All right, I hear that. There was a case recently, more than one case, where I forget who was this, a famous opera singer who was outed, and his concert was canceled, not because he touched someone, but they said that he looked at them in a certain way. And I think when you reach a situation, and you're seeing this certainly in America, where it's just become so extreme that if you look at somebody, I mean, you might be dressed a certain way to attract attention. Somebody looks at you, and then you call them a molester or an abuser. You actually hurt the case of the people who are really being abused. And there's no doubt about that. So there has to be, some level of intelligence and discretion between something that is serious and something that's frivolous. Okay, I'm going to let everybody go. I think it was important to have this discussion, and I hope that some good will come out of it, for at least encouraging people to come forward, and especially in the Haredi community, where silence is not a virtue, but silence is complicit with the crimes being committed. And people will come forward, and they will face this. You have to, face your fears and what's going on in your community, and save a lot of souls who until now have really been victimized without any hope of getting resolution for their situation. Everybody have a Shabbat Shalom, and we should hear good things. And see you next time, same place. and stay safe, everybody. Shabbat shalom.